Welcome back to our video series, Mindfulness, where Dharma meets practice. The topic of this third video is living in devotion. A popular adage states, "You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink it." I can lead the viewer to the Noble Eightfold Path and even offer oats in the next video, but will the viewer drink it? This issue is one of motivation. Entering fully into Buddhist practice is one of those truly life-altering decisions. So it's critically important that deep, steadfast, unwavering, and wholesome motivation stands behind our practice if we're to carry through on that decision. In both general mindfulness and in virtue, we've seen how motivation in our practice tends to come from finding satisfaction and fully inhabiting the practice task itself. It tends not to come from striving for some advantage beyond the practice task. We want to look in similar terms at the deeper currents of motivation behind all of our practice. Think about truly life-altering decisions. Think about the bold choices of the great explorers of virgin lands, of the hippies on a quest to India with nothing but a backpack, of people who buy an accordion or determined to learn to play it, of people about to get married and raise a family, of those setting out on a new education or career path, and of those who bring home a new St. Bernard puppy. Most of us have made life-altering decisions, but do we ever know what we're getting ourselves into? Such decisions generally arise from an initial sense of need or urgency, but this turns into a determination that requires entrusting ourselves to something we do not fully understand and then persevering when the unexpected arises. This takes enormous courage. Such decisions are well beyond the reach of the timid or of the deniers who cling fearfully to their certitude. It requires that we boldly resolve, "This will be the shape of my life," and then stick with it. What motivates such foolhardiness and then keeps it alive? The currents of motivation are deep, but we can tease out at least two key factors: trust and devotion. These must be present if we're to fully embrace Buddhist life. When these are present, we can expect that our practice and understanding will provide the primary meaning, direction, and outlook for our lives. Then into this, all other aspects of our life will find their place. The Buddhist path is long, a lot of work, and at least initially without noticeable results. Those of great aspiration need to be on fire, much as scientists or artists can be on fire. Catching fire begins with trust and develops into devotion. Let's begin with trust. Trust is also translated as faith or sometimes confidence in Buddhist literature. Trust fills the gap between the little we actually know and what we need to know to act with certitude. Trust is a necessary part of our choices, big or small, in all spheres of life. This is because we are karmic beings. That is, we repeatedly are called upon to act, but we have to do this with limited knowledge of an uncertain world. We have little certitude as to results. Trust can depend on the probability of desirable outcomes, as when we trust a friend's recommendation of a movie or of a dentist. But it can also depend on the absence of other viable alternatives, as when we have no idea where we are, so we have to choose to drive in an arbitrary direction and stick with it until we spot something familiar. Desperation is also like that. It makes us trust with poor odds of success. With less calculation, we're often persuaded to trust by erratic factors, such as a slick commercial or salesperson, the bedside manner of a doctor, or the charisma of a preacher, or the beauty of a Buddhist statue. Religion and patriotism in certain institutions often demand a communal ritual avowal of trust or faith. The word I'm translating as trust actually implies a kind of wholeheartedness. This is an important motivational factor that's perhaps better served by the word faith. But I'm avoiding the word faith because it often implies, in the modern context, something highly irrational. It's helpful in this regard to point out that trust in Buddhism serves as an encouragement for self-discovery that has nothing to do with blind faith. In fact, quite the opposite. Trust is likely to become firm as our practice of the Dharma establishes a strong track record. We'll get into this in more detail by the end of this video. In fact, the Pali word we're translating as trust comes from a root meaning put the heart on, so wholeheartedness. Making major choices out of low certitude trust, but with wholeheartedness, puts us in the realm both of greatest human foolhardiness and also of greatest human achievement. This is much as a scientist relentlessly pursues an initially unlikely path of investigation. Wholehearted trust comes with a level of motivation in excess of the odds. We best enter into Buddhist practice with the mind of the explorer of virgin lands. For most of us, Buddhism is a virgin land in which we over and over encountered the most unexpected things around the next turn in the path. We need a level of commitment to run with the choice we've entrusted ourselves to through thick or thin. Devotion is a sense of wholehearted commitment that motivates us to preserve our choices as valuable in themselves. We've discussed motivational structure in 2 previous chapters. Through mindfulness, we tend to inhabit the task as something satisfying and pursuing well, putting aside the utility of the task for some purpose outside of the task itself. Through virtue, we find satisfaction and delight in living within the broadest standards of harmlessness, giving, and kindness, instead of striving toward personal advantage. Devotion has a similar motivational structure, but at the higher level of overall life commitment. The meaning of the Pali word for devotion ranges over clear, bright, and glad, as well as pious. It's through devotion that we completely inhabit Buddhist practice and understanding. This is why this video is called Living in Devotion. As we live in devotion, we tend to lose me in the practice of Dharma itself. Of course, our practice and understanding do lead karmically to personal benefit. Aside from ending suffering, we may also have been told to hold other incentives in mind, that practice is a means to self-improvement, to less stress and anxiety, to rewiring the brain for happiness, to better sex, to mystical experiences, to better creativity or productivity, or to business success. These points may be true and may be valid initiators of practice, But devotion allows us to put unskillful striving towards such benefits aside. Devotion is our primary motivator. It allows us to settle into and fully inhabit our practice. Individual practice plays a key role in Buddhism. We're the heirs of our own karma. But the Buddha also recognized that humans are social beings and that our trust and devotion will take root primarily through the influence of others. It's important that we associate with the right people. An admirable friend is a wise person who is well informed in the Dharma, lives according to Dharma, and whose words and conduct are a source of inspiration for others. In effect, in early Buddhism, admirable friends were the teachers. They teach by example, if not by word. We're likely to learn the most from people of high attainment or spiritual progress. The importance of the admirable friend is expressed in a curious passage. As he was seated to one side, Venerable Ananda said to the fortunate one, "This is half of the holy life, Lord, having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues." Don't say that, Ananda. Don't say that. Having admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues is actually the whole of the holy life. When a monk has admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues, he can be expected to develop and pursue the Noble Eightfold Path. Admirable friends have themselves already entered deeply into virtue and wisdom. It's through these admirable friends that the meaning of the Buddha's life and awakening is revealed, and through these admirable friends that the Dharma is clarified step by step. This leads the student toward and along the path. We should seek out and befriend those in Buddhist communities whose practice we would like to emulate. Besides this, the Buddha created the Sangha, which is at core the monastic community where such adepts are trained, but also included lay, that is, non-monastic Buddhist adepts of great attainment. The Sangha serves to uplift the wider community by fulfilling three social functions. First, the Sangha is a source of admirable friends. Just as it benefits us to have artists and good plumbers among us, or good citizens, it ennobles us to have saints and sages, adepts, and awakened people in our midst. They make up an effective civilizing force. Second, the monastic Sangha provides an ideal context for Buddhist practice for those who want to pursue the holy life as far as possible. It does this by defining the life most conducive to upholding Buddhist principles, a life so barren of any opportunity for personal advantage that a me can scarcely find a footing. Third, the monastic Sangha is charged with the continuity of the Buddha's teachings. It plays a role much like the faculty of a university. Without full-time staff, scholarship would become anemic if it were to survive at all. The flourishing of the monastic Sangha ensures that there will be admirable friends of great attainment. The Buddha stated, in fact, that if the monks should have lived the life to perfection, the world should not lack for awakened ones. Keeping the flame of the Dharma burning bright is critical for the perpetuation of the teachings in their full integrity for future generations. Those teachings are subtle and sophisticated, but this means that they are also easily misinterpreted and get corrupted if they're not sustained by practitioners of attainment. In short, admirable friends tend to involve invoke trust, and inspire wholeheartedness and devotion. The root definition of Sangha is the monastic community of both monks and nuns. But the Buddha extended the word Sangha also to refer to some non-monastics, to noble lay people who have entered into at least the initial stage of awakening, called stream entry. In short, it is a concentration of highly qualified, admirable friends who tend to evoke trust and inspire us to wholehearted devotion. The devout Buddhist focuses trust in three sources of wisdom, which we trust in order to guide us in our spiritual development and how we conduct our lives. These three sources of wisdom are the Buddha, who is the awakened one, the historical founder of Buddhism, the Dharma, which is what the Buddha taught, or a functionally faithful representation of what the Buddha taught, and the Sangha, which is either the community of monastics or the noble Buddhist adepts, monastic or lay. The triple gem refers to these three sources of Buddhist wisdom, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Refuge is wholehearted devotion to the wisdom of the triple gem. Refuge is based not only on trust in the triple gem, but also in trust in our own capacity for practice and awakening. Trust in the triple gem is what first turns our heads resolutely toward virtue, wisdom, and serenity. It will grow progressively more discerning and acquire more depth as we repeatedly have the opportunity to check things out in our own experience. At some point, it'll turn to devotion. At that point, we may be determined to master the practice. The Dhammapada says, "He who has gone for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and his Sangha penetrates with transcendental wisdom the Four Noble Truths: suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the Noble Eightfold Path leading to the cessation of suffering." On the basis of refuge in the Triple Gem, we open our hearts and minds to the influence of the teachings of the Buddha. We then begin to study, practice, develop, and gain insight into them. Refuge is the center of our devotion. It's a home we inhabit in lieu of unwholesome striving, not just a place we would rather be. It feels like a safe and nurturing context in which our practice unfolds. The word refuge means a place of safety, and triple gem carries the same implications. Gems in ancient India were regarded as having protective powers. The practice of devotion gives mindfulness a key role as we bring our values, and particularly the triple gem, repeatedly to mind, so that they become an ever-present support for our path practices, a promoter of depth and ardency. Devotional practices are verbal, mental, and even bodily. They give Buddhism much of its appearance of religiosity. I should acknowledge that many modern Buddhists and would-be Buddhists reject whatever smells of religiosity. Buddhism as a religion is certainly an outlier, and many would like to leave it that way. For these, I point out that every element of religiosity has its equivalent in common secular contexts as well. For instance, in sports, in the military, and even at birthday and dinner parties. Also, these elements are rather thin in early Buddhism. And as with path practices, they have well-established functions for the benefit of practice. No further justifications should be necessary. About verbal refuge. Refuge is meant to be borne constantly in mind as the backdrop of the rest of our practice. One way to develop mindfulness of refuge is through daily recitation, explicitly to reflect on the qualities of the Buddha, of the Dharma, and of the Sangha. Traditionally, by bringing formulaic texts to mind and by reciting them aloud. Repetition helps us bear our devotion to the Triple Gem more readily in mind. Some qualities of the Buddha are that he is rightly self-awakened, consummate in knowledge and conduct, well-faring and expert regarding the world, unexpected, unexcelled as a trainer for those to be trained, the teacher of all, awakened, fortunate. This refers in short to his attainments of virtue, wisdom, and awakening, to his skills as a teacher, and to his benefit in having discovered the path. Some qualities of the Dharma are that it's well taught by the Buddha, visible, timeless, inviting in verification, leading to progress, to be realized by the wise for themselves. This refers to the empirical nature of the Dharma, to its provenance, and to its function. We'll explore some surprising and rather inspiring qualities of the Dharma in more detail a little bit later in this video. Some qualities of the Sangha are that it practices well, uprightly, systematically, and skillfully, is worthy of support and of respect, and is a field of merit. It's also critical for the propagation and perpetuation of Buddhist teachings. This refers to the quality of monastic practice and how the laity properly relates to monastics and to the historical role of the Sangha since the time of the Buddha, without which the Buddhist teaching we now enjoy would scarcely have survived. In addition to the mindfulness of the Triple Gem, the early discourses recommend that we reflect similarly on our own practice of the precepts, on our own giving, and on the heavenly realms. The heavenly realms are often used in reference to the karmic fruits of our actions and are therefore associated with purity. Each of these 6 mindfulness practices produces similar results leading to mental composure. When a noble disciple recollects the Buddha, on that occasion his mind is not obsessed by lust, aversion, or delusion. On that occasion his mind is simply straight, based on the Buddha. A noble disciple whose mind is straight gains inspiration in the meaning, gains inspiration in the Dharma, gains joy connected with the Dharma. When he is joyful, delight arises. For one with a delighted mind, the body becomes tranquil. One tranquil in body feels pleasure. For one feeling pleasure, the mind becomes composed. You should develop this recollection of the Buddha while waking, standing, sitting, and lying down. You should develop it while engaged in work and while living at home in a house full of children. What here is said about the Buddha is then repeated with regard to the Dharma, the Sangha, precepts, giving, and heavens. As for the practice of virtue, mindfulness of the Triple Gem gives rise to the same familiar progression. Delight gives rise to tranquility, gives rise to mental composure. Although we are looking at refuge primarily as a motivator for path practices, this passage tells us that refuge in itself produces roughly the same immediate fruits as path practices. We should understand that benefits accrue from devotional practices across the board and across religious traditions that we do well to respect. It's been shown empirically that the devoutly religious enjoy significantly improved mental and physical health, happiness, calm, and a sense of well-being and strong social bonds. About bodily refuge. We enhance refuge through verbal recitation, but even more through putting our bodies into it. Buddhists take a page out of the playbook of puppies who train for the abstract possibility of future fierce battles by putting their whole bodies and minds into play. This is a basic function of ritual, in which actions have a meaning beyond mere physical postures, just as gentle nips mean violent chomps for the puppy, meanings that are embodied in the action. Refuge is similarly embodied through gesture. The Buddha was venerated in his lifetime through prostrations, circumambulation, covering one's otherwise bare shoulder, sitting in a lower seat, standing upon the Buddha's arrival, not turning one's back on him, nor walking ahead of him. These are formalities based in early Indian etiquette and well documented in the earliest texts. To bow to the Buddha, even now to bow to a Buddha statue, is to enact reverence for the Buddha with both body and mind. To enact reverence for the Buddha is to re-experience refuge, that is, to open the heart and mind to the influence of the Buddha. Other practices venerate the Dharma. Many of the same physical expressions of veneration that applied to the Buddha have always been applied to the monastic Sangha and continue to be applied in the present day. Veneration toward the Sangha is, in a sense, easier today because it applies to the only living gem and therefore assumes a particularly personal quality. Although we are often dismissive of such devotional practices as bowing in modern culture, it's important that this, with time, be overcome for the benefit of our path practice. Ignoring devotional practices neglects a time-tested way we can better align with the Buddhist path. You'll be surprised, as I once was, to discover how much bowing, for instance, brings to practice. Devotional ritual practices also dovetail with the cultivation of general mindfulness discussed in our first video. Because of the often elaborate and normative nature of rituals, they demand that we keep in mind what we are doing. At the same time, our karmic actions take on a kind of sacred quality, as if every action has an exclamation point after it. A word about historically later devotional practices. Devotional practices in early Buddhism seem to have been simple, minimal, and functionally motivated as a support for the Noble Eightfold Path. In most later traditions, devotional practices seem to have generally continued to center around refuge, but to have blossomed into something much more elaborate and often freely mixed with elements of folk culture. For instance, with ancestor worship or with blessings for good fortune. After the Buddha's demise, veneration of the Buddha continued in ways that involve stupas, Bodhi trees, fabricated footprints of the Buddha, and after many centuries, Buddha statues. These were commonly augmented through ritual offerings of food, incense, and water. Some schools, like Pure Land Buddhism and modern Soka Gakkai, are fundamentally devotional, much like possibly the preponderance of world religions. My own sense is that these devotional elaborations are for the most part innocuous, for they strengthen refuge and rarely contradict Buddhist principles. It behooves us to respect the many exotic flavors of Buddhist devotional practice, but it's not necessary to practice them ourselves. They may satisfy a human need for devotional expression, not fully supported in early Buddhist texts. Most people are rightly wary, particularly in this scientific age, of placing trust in an ancient system of beliefs. It's appropriate at this juncture to come to a better understanding of just what the Dharma is. It's particularly important to understand that it is not a system of beliefs, but represents a middle way between conviction and skepticism that promotes our own process of experiential discovery. In brief, the Dharma is something we gradually make our own until eventually trust is no longer necessary. We don't need to be so wary in the case of the Dharma. The main emphasis of the Dharma is on the mind. It deals with the human dilemma, existential crisis, anguish, suffering, and dissatisfaction, delusion, misperception, selfishness, harmfulness, meaninglessness, and the rest. It treats these as human problems with human causes that arise in human minds, problems that require human solutions. The Dharma provides a program whereby the mind is tuned, honed, sharpened, tempered, straightened, tuned, and distilled into an instrument of virtue, serenity, and wisdom. The Dharma itself is among the greatest products of the human mind, skillfully articulated by the Buddha. The Dharma stands out in its economy. The Buddha characteristically took care not to teach more than was necessary. As a result, he carefully avoided useless speculation about topics irrelevant to the understanding or practice of the Dharma. This method is made clear in the handful of leaves simile. What do you think, monks? Which are the more numerous, the few leaves I have here in my hand, or those up in the trees of the grove? Lord, the fortunate one is holding only a few leaves. Those up in the trees are far more numerous. In the same way, monks, there are many more things that I have found out, but not revealed to you. What I have revealed to you is only a little. And why, monks, have I not revealed it? Because, monks, it's not related to the goal. It is not fundamental to the holy life. It does not conduce to disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, tranquility, higher knowledge, awakening, or nirvana. That is why I have not revealed it. Recall that the doctrine of the Buddha is only useful insofar as it promotes skillful practice. The resulting agnosticism with regard to many religious views and folk beliefs gives Buddhism its characteristic tolerance that allows us to blend easily with the presuppositions of various cultures. That is, insofar as these do not contradict the purpose of Dharma. For instance, whether one believes in tree spirits or in the flying spaghetti monster doesn't really matter as long as these beliefs are compatible with virtue and practical wisdom and do not obstruct serenity. On the other hand, the Buddha did not hesitate to criticize views that detract from spiritual development. One of these is annihilationism. the widely held view that nothing remains, including our karmic results, after the death of the body. The problem is that this view limits our willingness to take responsibility for the future. Another is eternalism, the opposing view that some essence, our soul, survives death. The problem is that this view promotes obsession. The middle way that he advocated led between these views. The Dharma also stands out in its empirical quality, pointing almost entirely to what can be verified in our direct experience. Many people in the West are inspired to trust the Dharma in the first place upon learning of this refreshing see-for-yourself quality of the Dharma. But some caution is called for. We should not think this means that we should trust our own experience above all else. In fact, for the Buddha, the typical uninstructed worldling, which is most of us, is actually astonishingly deluded. Most of us get hopelessly confused in trying to see, much less interpret, our own experience. Trying to verify the Dharma against these experiences is that much more difficult. The Kalama Sutta warns us not to see certainty in one's own thinking, nor in much of anything else. Come, Kalamas, do not go upon what has been acquired by repeated hearing, nor upon tradition, nor upon repetition, nor upon what is in Scripture, nor as a result of thought, nor upon an axiom, nor upon careful reasoning, nor out of delight in speculation, nor upon another's seeming ability, nor upon the thought, the monk is our venerable teacher. Kalamas, when you yourselves know these things are good, these things are not blamable, these things are praised by the wise, undertaken as a whole, these things lead to benefit and happiness, then enter on and abide in them. Elsewhere, it's suggested that effort is required to verify the Dharma against experience, since the Dharma is personally experienced by the wise. The Buddha invites us to come and see. But when he says come, he's shouting down at us flatlanders from the mountaintop. To arrive at his vantage point, we need to scramble up hills, struggle through brambles, and ford creeks. When the Buddha says see, we need to focus our eyes intently in the right direction to barely make out what the Buddha sees with great clarity of vision. In order to be willing to do all of this, we have to establish from the beginning trust that the Buddha knew what he was talking about. This is refuge. What else would induce us to make the difficult climb up the mountain? Investigation and personal verification are necessary parts of following the Dharmic path, but they take time and effort before we can say, I have come and now I see. Until then, trust is essential. Come is based on trust, and see is the eventual verification in our own experience. For instance, the Buddha taught that craving is the origin of suffering, which is the second noble truth. At first, this may seem, at least to some, to be an abstract proposition which we must ponder and try our darndest to match up with observation. The most likely hasty outcome is to dismiss this proposition as simply mistaken. It seems pretty clear to us, for instance, that buying titanium cufflinks would make us exceedingly dashing, and that would lead to improved prospects for romance and other forms of social and perhaps even business success. Therefore, we conclude craving clearly leads not to suffering, but to happiness. This is where taking seriously comes in. Taking Dharma seriously is refuge in the Dharma. Trust that the Buddha saw things rightly. Refuge entails that we decide to trust the Dharma before we draw naive or premature conclusions from our own experience or from what we naively think the Dharma says. This may require that we put aside our pre-Buddhist preconceptions or presuppositions. These are tacit assumptions, often instilled at a young age before our faculty of discrimination had fully developed, and not questioned since. Eventually, perhaps after years of investigation on and off the cushion, we might discover that the second noble truth is not complex at all. It is something that bites us on the nose over and over, day after day. We begin to notice that as soon as craving comes up, the suffering is right behind it, as immediate as a shadow. In fact, as soon as we need to have titanium cufflinks, there is stress and anxiety, unmistakably. We might discover that we've been living in a world of incessant suffering, a world of flame all along without noticing it. In brief, what we trust the Buddha to have seen rightly bears a causal relationship to what we see for ourselves, such that practice turns trust into wisdom. Now, trust here is not about belief. Holding Dharma loosely is a quality of mindfulness whereby we do not think only this is true, anything else is worthless. That is, we don't believe the Dharma, rather we accept it as an adaptable working assumption. What we hold loosely has much the quality of a question as of an answer. In fact, notice that in the passage from the Kalama Sutta that I cited earlier, the ultimate criterion for evaluating the worth of a teaching is ethical or practical. That is, whether practice on the basis of the teaching is of benefit, not whether only this is true, anything else is worthless. In the Chunky Sutta, we learn that anything accepted through faith, approval, oral tradition, reasoning, or pondering may or may not turn out to be true. At this, the young Brahmin, Chunky, asks how, then, truth is to be preserved. If a person has trust, his statement, "This is my trust," preserves the truth. But he doesn't yet come to the definite conclusion that only this is true, anything else is worthless. To this extent, there is the preservation of the truth. To this extent, one preserves the truth. I describe this as the preservation of the truth, but it is not yet the discovery of the truth. The Buddha then repeats this formula about trust with regard to approval, to oral tradition, to reasoning, to analogy, or to pondering out. The only thing that is certain is that things are uncertain. Nothing is to be believed unconditionally, and so blind faith cannot arise under the Buddha's instructions. The Buddha then shows how truth is discovered and then finally realized. The implication being that if a proper teaching is accepted as a working assumption, it will eventually become something seen directly. That is, it'll be known for oneself with wisdom as one's practice progresses. What mindfulness bears in mind is not frozen truths, but malleable or working assumptions that the practitioner will further shape to match experience as it is better understood through practice. Eventually, they will become internalized as a matter of direct perception. At this point, trust serves no further purpose. The last passage is a remarkable illustration of the care with which the Buddha made use of trust and of other ways of accepting that which falls short of realization in direct experience. We humans like to find meaning in that which is bigger than us. For instance, seeing oneself as one member in a long family history gives us a sense of purpose. This legacy is a source of energy, responsibility, and devotion, and these shape our attitudes and behaviors in significant ways. Higher meaning for the scientist is found in contribution to the forward march of human knowledge. Higher meaning in many religions can come with seeing oneself in the service of God. The meanings we find are not necessarily wholesome. Presumably, ruthless emperors find meaning in expanding and perpetuating their empires through conquest. The eminent psychiatrist Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor. He observed that an important predictor of the survival of inmates in death camps was what kind of future lay beyond the barbed wire. What was there to live for? This would include surviving family members. Frankl himself looked forward to completing his disrupted research. Meaning is a great selfless motivator. It's an essential aspect of devotion. It carries our practice along like a log in a great river. Have you known artists who cannot not do art, or musicians who cannot not do music? There are also scientists and scholars who cannot not do science or scholarship. One way Buddhists find meaning is in promoting Buddhist teachings for society at large or for future generations. Another way Buddhists find meaning is through an understanding of the epic nature of practice. This is expressed in this verse. All my ancient twisted karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow. I first encountered this voice in an early Zen meditation retreat in the spring of 1998. My first suspicious thought on hearing this was, oh, someone's trying to push the rebirth thing. Now, at this time, I viewed practice as a matter of how I met the present. It had little to do with past and future. Practice was for me like having a new office job in which my task is to take documents, let's say insurance claims, mindfully one by one from the inbox, process them, and place the results in the outbox. This would let me remain totally in the present as I was told I was supposedly supposed to do. I was also told that a future paid check was forthcoming. However, the next morning, while we were once again intoning this verse, I discovered that my eyes had unaccountably teared up and that I had a lump in my throat. It got so bad that it was hard for me to croak along with the words. Every morning after that, I had the same response. What was going on? Somehow the meaning of this verse had struck me to the core. It was as if my whole bungled karmic past, the mistakes I had made, the people I had hurt, the opportunities and energy I had squandered, were suddenly laid bare, and it seemed clear that they extended far back beyond memory into ancient times as accumulation of karmic results that now loomed menacingly and inescapably behind me, around me, and in me. The outlook that came from this was a sense of karmic continuity. It was like learning from an office colleague that the person who had had my job processing insurance claims before me was so lazy and so terribly behind in his work that he had routinely taken bundles of documents from the inbox and stored them in the adjacent room for eventual processing. Looking in the adjacent room, I discovered an alarming backlog of boxes of unprocessed documents, along with bundles of still more documents tied together with twine stacked up high, bundle on bundle, box on box, and bundle on box. I realized that there was suffering in the form of an unpaid claim in each of those pending documents. Dismay toward a bungled past brings with it an urgent sense of responsibility toward a still untainted future. I would have to put in many overtime hours on my shift to make sure these valid claims were paid. Amazingly, the quality of my Buddhist practice changed a lot after avowing my ancient twisted karma. Suddenly, I was doing more than trying to sustain purity of mind moment by moment. I was engaged in a cosmic battle with terrible ancient twisted karmic forces that threaten the future. Standing at the gateway between past and present, I was boldly proclaiming, staff in hand, "You shall not pass." Did I now believe in rebirth? I could see that I was on to something very real, but didn't feel I needed to analyze it any more in specific terms. This is the brilliance of taking seriously but holding loosely. Perhaps practice will lead to further analysis, perhaps not. But what the hell, it sure supercharged my practice. It gave it a lot of meaning. It's in these terms that the Buddha addressed skeptics of rebirth, that is, in terms of human benefit, not in terms of only this is true, anything else is worthless. The Buddha gives us an example of an unskillful viewpoint. There are some contemplatives and Brahmins who hold this doctrine, hold this view. There is nothing given, nothing offered, nothing sacrificed. There is no fruit or result of good or bad actions. There is no this world, no next world, no mother, no father, no spontaneously reborn beings, no Brahmins or contemplatives who, faring rightly and practicing rightly, proclaim this world and the next, after having directly known and realized it for themselves. This viewpoint denies karma and its fruits, the roles of giving and responsibility, refuge in the higher realization of others, and rebirth into another, hopefully more felicitous world. The Buddha points out that this viewpoint, whether true or false, is likely to condition the behavior of such contemplatives and Brahmins in an unskillful way. It can be expected that they will adopt and practice these three unskillful activities: bad bodily conduct, bad verbal conduct, bad mental conduct. Why is that? Because these venerable contemplatives and Brahmins do not see in unskillful activities the drawbacks, the degradation, the defilement, nor in skillful activities the benefit of renunciation as cleansing. Here's the kicker. A person of this view cannot win whether their view turns out to be true or false in the end. Assume there is no other world, and so on. This good person is still criticized in the here and now by the observant as a person of bad habits and wrong understanding, one who holds to a doctrine of non-existence. On the other hand, if there really is a next world, then this venerable person has made a bad throw twice, in that he is criticized by the observant here and now, and in that, with the breakup of the body after death, he will be reborn in a plane of deprivation. Thus, this incontrovertible teaching, when poorly grasped and poorly adopted by him, covers one side. He gives up the skillful option. Fundamentally, this describes a purely pragmatic condition for accepting one of two alternative viewpoints on the basis of a kind of cost-benefit analysis, or we might say a means of covering one's bets. This by itself justifies its acceptance as a kind of working assumption. The Buddha makes a similar argument in the Kalama Sutta with regard to realizing the fruits of karma in the next life. It is clear that he recommends that karma and rebirth be accepted as working assumptions by the skeptical. He seems, by the way, at the same time, confident that their truth will eventually be discovered and finally realized in the diligent practitioner's own experience. The practitioner may find the discovery is of something other than what she expected.